question.
Yeah, okay. So we'll start exploring some of these issues in a little bit more depth. So the next question, the SCoPEd project has often cited the importance of mapping existing training and practice requirements of counsellors and psychotherapists. That's kind of been something at the forefront that it's been mentioned since the beginning. How accurately does the panel think that the second iteration of SCoPEd represents the work and training of counsellors and psychotherapists in the UK? And if we could come to Jay first.
Yeah, I mean, I think in terms of hours and things like that, the sort of more quantitative measures, if you like, the job is okay. You know, as someone else said, you know, not necessarily that complicated to kind of come up with these 3 columns and work out how many hours training and how many hours therapy and so forth. But in terms of what they think we know and don't know as counsellors and psychotherapists, I don't think it's as good. For instance, I'll just give you one example. They don't seem to think counsellors do PhDs, which I think would be news to a lot of counsellors that have PhDs.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you. Rima, what do you think of that question?
I think it was a useful starting point to see where the training field overall and sort of qualifications, hours, and how we vary in terms of supervision, personal therapy, what all these requirements are. So yeah, it's a useful to kind of as a starting point, but most definitely not as an ending point. And actually, I don't know if some of the people that are on Twitter, but yesterday there's such a powerful thread about therapists coming forward and sharing their stories of how they entered the profession and what they went through personally. But you know, the real grit that it takes to become a therapist. And I found it so powerful, and it actually makes me emotional right now thinking about it. But just that's missing, I think, the nuances in our stories. I would love our stories to be part of this. And you know, I've got a story to share of how I became a therapist, and it's not, you know, what you might see is a therapist in category potentially in C with a master's and all the rest of it, but actually none of my journey's been kind of shown in this framework. And for me, I think that our journey as a therapist and what it takes us to be a therapist really needs to be at the heart of this project, so that employers can really understand us, clients can get what we're about in a sense, and have trust in our profession, and same for trainees. You know, what's ahead, and sort of showing trainees what's the training journey going to involve. You know, because I had quite a big warning from my trainers that said, you know, this is really going to pull you apart, and we don't know how you're going to come back at the end of this training. And that really stuck with me, because you are transforming whilst you're on training, and that's not captured for me in this framework, and I'd love for it to be captured, and I think it can be captured, and that's why I don't see this as an end point. I would love to now add the heart and soul of who we are onto this map.
Thank you. I think that's a really interesting point. And I think even if people aren't on Twitter, they could search the hashtag SCoPEd or SCoPEd debate and actually see some of those threads that you're talking about, and people actually really opening up in a lot of detail about their journey to becoming a therapist, and their worries and concerns about how they would then fit into this kind of framework really, and what impact it would have on them. So I would encourage people to kind of seek that out. Even if you're not on Twitter, you can search for those. Emma, can we come to you?
Okay, I hope everyone can hear me a bit better. I've had a tinkle with my microphone.
I can hear you.
Good. So I fundamentally think the fundamental problem with this framework, I'll put this in context. I've worked previously for the Association of the British Pharmaceutical Industry. So I have put together loads of consultations on policies about governing the pharmaceutical industry in the UK. And actually, I contacted the ACP when I was still a member last year, offering my expertise. And one of the things that is fundamentally wrong with this framework is actually that they've confused training and practice. It's all well and good, but yes, what they've done is create a table to show the 3 different kind of training routes, but then superimposing that onto practice is a fundamental flaw, because the actual being in actual practice is about competency. So if you've finished your training and you can demonstrate a certain level of competency in doing a role with experience or CPD and stuff like that, you can actually be extremely competent in something at any level. And I'll give an example again from the framework. If we look at 2.4 in the framework, an A person is an ability to draw upon knowledge of common mental health problems and their presentation during assessment and throughout therapy. Fine, everybody knows that at qualification at level 4. But when you go into the C column for 2.4b, it says the ability to understand the language and discourse around diagnosis, psychopathology, and mental disorders. So fundamentally, if I've been on a course about the DSM and understand all the language about diagnoses of various mental health problems, what this is saying is that I would have to have had a level 7 qualification before I can put myself in the C column. Not that I'm at level 4 in my training, but my competence has been assessed because I have a very full and experienced understanding about diagnosis and mental disorders. So that's where I think the framework goes wrong. It's that it's missing or mixing training and practice, which are 2 very different things. If you want to look at people's practice, you have to look at their competencies, assess them against those, because your training doesn't necessarily give you the competence to make you any more senior than anybody else. So that's one of the things I just think is one of the fundamental flaws. And until they have a clear understanding of training versus practice, the framework's never really going to work for anybody.
Okay, thank you. And I think we will talk about a little bit more in detail in the next couple of questions around the different aspects of that framework and moving within the framework. So thank you. Andy, I think if we can come to you next.
Yeah, I suppose just to pick up on that point really, and sort of Rima's point about the journey of being a therapist and how that's a sort of personal sort of, it's not a quantitative thing. It can't be boiled down to how many hours you've done of this or that. You know, it's a holistic thing. It's a sort of growth process, and that's completely missed. And of course, it can't be included in a competence framework using this methodology because those kinds of qualities aren't subject to that kind of analysis. So they can't. You almost can't boil that down in the right way for it to appear in this spreadsheet, particularly one that's purporting to be evidence-based and using a particular methodology which claims to be evidence-based. So being a therapist isn't a sort of input-output thing, like you do X, Y, Z, and then this thing comes out the end. It's a sort of unique, relational, and people are all sorts of different points and stages and phases of their lives on all sorts of levels of training, and I think what Emma was saying about the work and training is sort of conflated in the framework, because initially the argument was that the SCoPEd is about mapping training. That's all we're doing. We're just mapping the entry points. But it obviously isn't. It's trying to talk about the role you can be after periods of work. And so we've now got talk of progressing between columns and post-qualification experience, allowing movement up the hierarchy and so on. But again, this is going back to my point earlier about this doing a disservice to the reality of actual therapy practice. if I can sort of come to the politics of it again, there seems to be an attempt by certain groups, within UKCP and BPC, the British Psychoanalytic Council specifically, to try and sort of take ownership of depth and complexity. So that the sort of lower level counsellors are sort of seen as offering something, you know, just less in depth, you know, sort of less complicated, less nuanced, you know, less skillful. And sort of weaving through that, we can't ignore the sort of modality issue again there. And this is something I've written about perhaps at length. But person-centered therapy and much of the principles of person-centered therapy is basically erased in SCoPEd, and it's certainly in the first version. In the second version, they've made some concessions around language. They sort of softened unconscious to include out of awareness, as if to, you know, sort of to appease the person-centered lobby almost. But and I've no problem with psychoanalytic thinking. I find it fascinating, you know. But to think that there is in practice that one approach is inherently deeper or better is a fiction, really. And it says more about the sort of power struggles between theories than the actual reality of practice. So the fact that something which purports to be evidence-based and factual and rooted in what's actually happening is so kind of like a part of a certain way of seeing the world, and that it's been a sort of, it's echoed and reproduced all these power dynamics. It's really worrying, because what that tells you is that the idea of it being a sort of factual evidence-based document is actually itself a bit of an illusion. And I mean, well, we could go into where does that bias come from, and how has that ended up playing out, that psychoanalytic work has been kind of found its place at the top of the hierarchy. And you know, you can look at the construction of the or the membership of the ERG, the Expert Reference Group, and how there was no person-centered representation. You know, this has been widely criticised. There was a mild concession made to invite someone who was identified as a person-centered and pluralist, so, but also an extra psychoanalytic member. And I think these things are important. You know, they're not just gripes. You know, they matter, because a genuine kind of person-centered representation would have made all sorts of challenges about the way that the project has evolved, about the way it's speaking about therapeutic work, the way it's trying to boil it down into competencies themselves, which again exclude the very kind of heart and soul stuff, as Rima said earlier on. You know, so I mean, the original question is, how does it represent work and training? Well, at some level, it represents some training, but it doesn't represent what therapy is really about. You know, and again, it's amazing how much work can be done, and then you miss the kind of the center of something, the heart of it, the core of it. It just sort of evaporates in all this kind of technical language, and yeah. So I suppose that's where I am with that bit.
Okay, thank you. Just picking up on that point in terms of the representation of approaches within the SCoPEd framework, I know that there has been quite a few different people talking on Twitter about that, but actually not just from the person-centered modality, but from lots of different modalities. So someone existential the other day who was kind of saying, this does not represent what I do as a therapist. And I know that there was some responses on Twitter, which was, well, we need the SCoPEd project needs to hear about you. You need to kind of share your views. And I think for me, there's a kind of a problem there, almost, that it is the individual therapist's responsibility to highlight to the SCoPEd project where the gaps are and what modalities are not included in that. And I think that is problematic, because you know, not every single therapist is involved in this consultation, is responding. And I think really that it's the other way around. The project should be outlining, if it's mapping it out, should be mapping out what all of us do, and not just what some of us do. Okay, Erin, if you want to answer that question.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I'm thinking similar to Andy, just about how different modalities are still kind of privileged, and I think it's disempowering, both to those that do subscribe to kind of ideas such as unconscious, and it's also disempowering, as Andy described, to those who don't. So if you're a tier B therapist and you want to be tier C, but you don't subscribe to the idea of, if you don't think that mental health placement is relevant to your work, or you don't think that getting a level 7 qualification is relevant to your work, you can't become tier C. Your employment prospects are potentially restricted because you're not willing to subscribe to some of the tier C competencies. And conversely, I mean, I was talking on Twitter the other day to somebody who would find themselves in tier A, but qualified as a Gestalt therapist, and the unconscious is inherent in the Gestalt modality, working with dreams and that kind of thing. And I think there's a real question about what would happen to a therapist who was working outside of competency according to SCoPEd. I don't think that question has been answered by BACP. So, for example, if there was a complaint made about a therapist who had, been working therapeutically with a rupture, because working therapeutically with a rupture is a tier C competency, I think BACP have a real question to answer about whether there could be a sanction for a tier B therapist working therapeutically with rupture. So I think there's some real questions to answer there about kind of how restrictive is this going to be? Is it going to be a case that tier A and tier B therapists just can't do tier C things? And if not, what is the meaning of it? If we can all use any competencies, what's the meaning of the framework at all? So I think there's some real questions to answer around how this looks in practice and how this could possibly work.
That's great, Erin. Thank you very much. Before we move on to our next kind of question, is there anything anybody wants to kind of come back on or talk about before we move on to another area? I feel like we've covered it. Yeah,
I just want to say I was really moved by what Rima said. Obviously, anyone watching could see that thinking about her own personal journey and other people's journeys was kind of getting you emotionally there. And I think that's a real truth. I really felt that. That's a real truth of what's going on at the moment. And that is why it's very, very hard for a lot of people. And I think that really needs to be heard and understood. Thank you, Pam.